What sort of questions do you have about this? About either this, what I've talked about, or about anything to do with the Constitution? If I don't know, I'll just make it up. Yes, ma'am.
You said something about Madison and established religions, but I didn't understand what it was.
Madison's big cause, the thing that he was most concerned about on a personal and on a constitutional level, was what he called freedom of conscience. We might call it more broadly freedom of thought. And if he and Jefferson were together on an issue, that was the issue. Madison hated the fact that all 13 of the original states had established, or most of them did, if not all 13, had established churches. That is, an official church of the state, and to varying degrees, there were oppression of all other religions. Virginia, his home, the Commonwealth of Virginia, the colony of Virginia, had for many years had an established religion. It was the Anglican Church. Everybody had to pay a tax, even if you were a Jew, even if you didn't want to go. In fact, basically, you didn't have to go to church as long as you paid a fee. Patrick Henry was big on that. In fact, after the Revolution, he wanted to reenact that taxation. And it was in 1786, before the Constitution, during that Confederation period. In Virginia, Patrick Henry, the big powerful governor, proposes the reinstitution of that tax. And Madison outmaneuvers him and writes a very famous document. Anybody ever read the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments? It sounds a big title. It's a short document. The Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. It was basically a pamphlet saying this is a really bad idea and here's why it's a bad idea. It's a great document, and he won. He not only prevented the reinstitution of a tax, he then had a document that was written by Jefferson many years earlier in 1779 that had been put on a shelf, had it enacted, and that's called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That's a document to read too. It's not that long. I believe it begins, correct me here if I'm wrong, Dan, whereas the Lord has made the mind of man free. How many laws begin that way? Okay? And just goes on basically to say it's not government's job to tell us what to think, and we're not going to stand for it. That was Madison's big cause. But he knew that there were the Patrick Henrys were running around. Madison wanted to ban all established churches in any state or in the new national government. He lost at the state level, but he won at the national level. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That first clause is the Establishment Clause. But he only got half a loaf. Jefferson said half a loaf is better than none. So Madison's fears, especially about established religion, were real. Yes?
Why was Patrick Henry, so in favor? Why did he want this?
That's a really interesting question. He was just a very religious man. Patrick Henry was a very religious man. Now, I happen to disagree with Patrick Henry on that issue, but I've come to have a fair amount of respect for Patrick Henry. He was also a self-made man. He came from nothing. He turned out into one of the leading lawyers of his time. Has anyone heard of Red Hill? Red Hill? That's his last home. It's still in Virginia. It's near Lynchburg, Virginia. It is worth a trip. Or if you can't go to my radio show. We have a two-part episode there. Again, it's called Your Weekly Constitutional. And yes, I know there's another connotation of that term. When I thought of the name of the show, I thought constitutional has two meanings. One, having to do with the Constitution. Secondly, a nice, healthy walk. Right? So we're going to have a walk with the Constitution. And I started telling people the name of the show, and they started snickering. And finally someone said, you know what I refer to when I talk about having a constitutional, and then he explained it had something to do with evacuation. Well, it had something to do with shitholes, okay? And so I laughed, and I actually considered changing the name of the show, and then I thought, nah, it makes it memorable. So I also said to people, if you only do that once a week, I'm sorry for you. Okay. Patrick Henry's fascinating. Listen to the episodes on Red Hill. Absolutely. Question?
This is your opinion.
Sure.
The Bill of Rights strengthens the Constitution or weakens the Constitution?
I think that it strengthens it immeasurably. Okay? Another objection I didn't give, among the many that Madison had, was that he called it a parchment barrier. He says it doesn't make any difference to write down a right. What we really need is for people to respect their rights. But eventually he said, you know, people can't respect their own rights and defend them unless they know what they are. So maybe this is an educational purpose as well. And I think that's extremely important. And the fact that we can point at a document and we can say, Congress is not going to establish a religion. Okay? And no one is going to prevent our free exercise of religion. No one's going to infringe our freedom of speech. There it is. So we all know those are important. In fact, if there's any reason I did my radio show, it's because I don't think Americans know enough about their Constitution. If you don't know about your Constitution, how can you defend your Constitution? Question, yes, sir.
Yes, my understanding that William Penn, he came to establish Pennsylvania, one of the important points of the freedom of conscience. And I was wondering if there was influence there from Madison and Pennsylvania.
There were a lot of people who came over here, and part of their motivation was religious freedom. I honestly don't know a lot about William Penn. I've mostly seen him through the prism of Franklin and the Pennsylvanians who fought his family. But it's quite possible because there's a strong Quaker tradition in Pennsylvania, and one of the tenets of Quakerism or of the Society of Friends is religious tolerance. To this day, if you go to the University of Pennsylvania, you will, to this day, I still think that spirit's there. It's a marvelous, marvelous institution, and to this day, there's such a feeling of tolerance and openness and friendliness there, and I think you can trace it all the way back to that era. Another fellow, you're talking about people who have religious tolerance as part of their identities. Who's heard of Roger Williams? Yeah. I'm not talking about the basketball team, okay? Roger Williams, Rhode Island, right? Right. Roger Williams, and I don't have time to go into all of this, is a dissenter in Britain, goes to prison, gets out of prison, comes over where the other dissenters are in Massachusetts Bay, right? Pisses them off because he's got his own ideas and he's preaching his own stuff. They eventually ban him, and they banish him to the woods, which was basically a death sentence. He goes out, and instead of being killed by the indigenous people, all of a sudden there's buds because he's not trying to impose anything on them. Hey, I'm Roger Williams. How the heck are you? Yeah, I've got this really cool idea. You want to come? I'll tell you about it. No, by the way, what's your idea? Let's talk about it. He walks his way down to a place that was eventually called the Rhode Island Plantations, and then gets his own charter and founds an entire state on the idea of religious tolerance. Extraordinary fellow. I've asked people, did Jefferson and Madison get influenced by Williams? And the answer I keep getting is that there's no evidence of it. And that's kind of disturbing to me because he really was one of the first champions of that. You had a follow-up? Yes, sir.
Well, just don't forget the role of two women that played in that.
Yeah, let's bring some women into it. Who's that?
Mary Dyer.
Uh-huh.
Went back to the Massachusetts Bay College to teach freedom of conscience.
Right.
And go after that was college on her life.
Right.
And then she was hung. And Mary Dyer, Ann Hutchinson.
Yes, yes.
Got her tongue cut out. And
Ouch.
if you go to, yeah, if you go to Boston, go to the State House, there, you'll see statue of Mary Dyer and statue of Ann Hutchinson.
Very good, and thank you for bringing that up. I said at the beginning, sorry, ladies, it's mostly guys. That's not because women weren't. It's not because women weren't doing things. It's because their contributions were frequently behind the scenes or not acknowledged or suppressed. So that's another area where we're learning more and more about that sort of thing. Yes?
Now, are those who are thrilled when a constitutionalist is appointed to the Supreme Court? What are the advantages and disadvantages of having a constitutionalist?
I'm going to have to ask you to define what you mean by constitutionalist.
I don't know.
Okay.
Hear this word
My
bandied
question
around.
is the
Yeah.
term originalist.
Okay. It's funny you should ask this. I literally just taught a class, I think, yesterday on schools of constitutional interpretation. And this is what I will say. There are 9 members of the Supreme Court, right? I'm standing in the middle. Who am I?
What's his name?
Kennedy, a conservative Republican. Who was in the middle before Kennedy? O'Connor, a conservative Republican. That's the middle of our Supreme Court. The court keeps moving to the right, so the middle keeps moving to the right. Now, on your right, who's over here? Who's the first one you come to? Maybe Alito, maybe Gorsuch. We don't know a lot about him yet. Pretty conservative guy. You move a little bit more. Well, actually, maybe the first person you'd come to in terms of conservatism is Roberts. He's sort of a big business, traditional conservative. In that regard, not very socially conservative. I think Gorsuch and Alito may be a little bit more conservative across the board. Who do you come to next? Thomas, okay, he's over here. Who we got on this side? Not yet. First one we get is probably Breyer. He's the only guy in the girls' club over here, okay? Then we get to the women. Sotomayor, Kagan, birds of a feather, right? Very similar outlooks. Sort of traditional, democratic, not really extreme, you know, in terms of their philosophy or the things that they do. And then there's Ginsburg, okay, and she's over here. I don't know that she's necessarily any more liberal in her outlook than Kagan or Sotomayor or even Breyer, but I think she's the acknowledged leader of the liberal wing now. She's the oldest one. She's been there. If you like her, you need to pray every morning that she wakes up again. I mean, she's getting old. She's getting old. And things could change rather radically if anybody on this side were to pass away. For the moment, generally people will acknowledge there's a 5-4 majority of more conservative people, with Kennedy occasionally betraying the cause by doing things, you know, like gay rights, things of that sort. But for the most part, it's 5-4, and it's a pretty conservative court. Now, we've oriented ourselves. How do these people justify what they do? Because they typically they devote on an ideological basis. And let's be honest, we're all adults. It's probably results-oriented in most cases. In most cases, come to them. They probably know where they're going to come out, so it becomes an exercise in how do I justify this and convince maybe people in the future that I'm right. Because that's the way it goes. Well, the people on your right, on the right, will call themselves textualists, strict constructionists, originalists, whether it's original meaning or original intent. Those are all the terms you hear over here. What do they mean? A textualist will say, I just read it. If it ain't in there, it ain't in there. Abortion, it's not in there. End of story. Okay, textualist. They will justify this perspective by saying, my job is just being a judge, and I don't need to put my spin on the Constitution. Famously, 2005, Chief Justice Roberts, I'm just an umpire. Nobody comes to a ball game to see an umpire. I calls them as I sees them. Did anybody believe that? No. But it played very well, didn't it? Okay, because even if you have the most straightforward clause in the Constitution, and the one I always mention is that the president has to be 35 years old, right? Is that 35 when he's elected? Is that 35 when he takes office? If he's elected at the age of 34, does he just wait until he turns 35 and then takes office? Even a straightforward provision requires some sort of interpretation, and as soon as you interpret, then all of a sudden your spin, whatever that might be, conservative, liberal, somewhere in between, is going to enter into it. Many strict constructionists and textualists basically mean the same thing. You know, I'm just going to read it. Many of them will acknowledge that some of these clauses need some interpretation. Okay, if we have to go beyond the actual language, the actual text, what are we looking for? Oh, well, we're looking for what the people who drafted this meant. And that's, well, let's acknowledge, that has a certain appeal, doesn't it? Well, some people wrote it. What did they mean by it? Okay, we can go back and look historically and say, what did a word in the 18th century mean that's different from now? One example, to liquidate something. If someone says he wants to liquidate something today, it means he wants to sell it. If he's talking about a person, it means he wants to kill him, right? Liquidate in the 18th century apparently meant to clarify something. Okay? So maybe it's legitimate to go back and look at what a different meaning might have been, a common meaning of a word. Okay, that's an original meaning. Original intent, well, let's look at what the founders, the people who wrote that provision, said about it. And maybe we can figure out what they meant. Problem. There were 55 white guys at the Constitutional Convention. There were 38 signatures on the document. 39 signatures, only 38 signers. One guy signed for his bud. The bud was sick. Okay? So are we talking about those guys? There were probably thousands of people who participated in the various ratifying conventions. Are we talking about those guys? All of them, or many of them, had wives who talked to them about this. Should we take their opinions into account? I suspect I know where this group would come out. Okay? So now we got another couple of thousand people. Okay? Whose intent? We always say the founders and the framer. Who are these guys? I can come up with a short list, but where do you stop? Okay? Let me ask you this. Anyone going to have pizza this weekend? You have your friends over, watch some football? Pizza? Okay? When you got 3 people in a room, can anybody agree on what goes on that pizza? Okay? Maybe you eventually compromise on something, but does every person in that room equally think that, you know, that's what the pizza should be? And I meant this when I said I would agree to onions on the pizza in exchange for anchovies. And by the way, pineapple on pizza, it's just wrong. Okay. My point is that it was a compromise that they reached. What did each of those people mean? What did they mean when they did that? Were they happy with it? Was it perfect? Was it the perfect expression of what they wanted? Or did they have to compromise on the onions in order to get the anchovies? Same thing with these guys. I mean, Patrick Henry was a bad example. He wasn't part of it. James Madison might have had one idea when he wrote a clause, and Alexander Hamilton had a different idea. And George Washington had a different idea. So I think there's actually a book out there recently written called The Myth of Original Intent. How can you even figure it out? Now, on the other side here, these liberals over here, they're not very good at naming themselves. They call themselves non-originalists. Sometimes, in order to avoid the negative sobriquet, they'll say something like, we believe in a living, breathing Constitution. Do you see that that gives a judge a lot more power? It does. Because somebody like Ginsburg will say, there was no internet in 1787. So we've got to consider what's happened between, if we want that old document to remain relevant. And she is very upfront about it. People on the right, at least in theory, are tethering themselves very closely to the document. And they will say, we believe in limited judicial powers. That's why we're originalists. That's why we're strict constructionists. That has an appeal. It has that Chief Justice Roberts appeal. I'm just the umpire. Whereas we're justifiably concerned if judges can simply go in and say the Constitution means whatever I say it means. Anyone remember a fellow named Justice Thomas Brennan? Early 60s, Warren Court, big fat... Pardon me? He did, and you know, you look kind of like him. Well, he's a great-looking guy. Absolutely. When Thomas Brennan was asked, what does the Constitution mean, he always said exactly the same thing. He just held up his hand like that. And of course, people would say, what do you mean, Justice Brennan? The Constitution, he would explain, means whatever 5 members of this court say it means. Now, that sounds pretty arrogant, doesn't it? Sounds pretty cynical, doesn't it? It's the truth. It is the truth. And one decade or 1 year, they can say that the Constitution means black, and the next year it means white. And that has happened. It's happened with great frequency in the last few years. The current conservative court has overturned dozens and dozens of precedents from earlier years. And if you trace the history of various constitutional provisions, you will see that courts have gone 180 degrees over a period of decades on some issues. That's basically constitutional history. We go this way, we go that way. We go this way, we go that way. The same clause diametrically opposed. Well, there's that one big example. Dred Scott on the one hand and Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Right? Slaves are not human beings, therefore they can't vote or be the subject of a federal lawsuit or, sue in federal court. That was what Dred Scott said. These people are not humans, they're property, and they can never be citizens of our nation. Okay? We rethought that one. Okay? And appropriately so. But that's the power of 5 people on that court. You got another question? Yes?
Are we ever
Well, we are a republic that has a lot of democratic aspects to it. In fact, the term that law professors will use is we are a majoritarian nation. That is, for the most part, when there's a decision to be made, we vote on it. The majority typically rules. But what makes us not a direct democracy, but a republic, is that we typically vote for representatives who then in turn vote on the issues. Or we'll vote for a president who will make certain decisions. Or we'll vote for senators who will then go to Congress and they will then vote on a nomination for the Supreme Court made for this, by the president, and then when the Supreme Court comes together, then they will vote. So it's always important to be in the majority if you want your things to be enacted, but it's not pure. It's not like New England where we just get together and have a town meeting. What are we going to do this week? That's pure democracy. And that's the relationship between the two. Yes, sir.
Freedom of speech. One of the things that's worrisome to me is that as they query high school students, the last data that I saw, the sheer bulk of high school students believe that one should not have the right to say what they think, that it should be controlled. I personally believe that open and free discussion in a democracy makes for a stronger democracy. The question that I have is our constitutional right of freedom of speech, as it plays to exactly what we see happening today, to where we have foreigners in this country that run corporations and what have you. They speak their mind on any number of different things. And of course, they suffer the consequences if people disagree with them. But this thing with Russia, where they used social media to propose certain ideas and what have you, how does this play to our freedom of speech idea and the sharing of ideas in an open society?
Freedom of speech is one of the most important parts of our Constitution. I like to say, and I'm not the first to say it by any means, but I like to say that freedom of speech is so important because it's so closely related to freedom of thought. There is a difference. I mean, I can have a thought in my head and it has value even if it never goes beyond my skull, right? It has value to me. But for the most part, value is when I communicate my ideas to you and when you communicate your ideas to me. And if we're seeking truth, whether in the scientific realm or the social realm or any realm, free discussion of ideas, even really offensive ideas, is essential. So that is one of the bedrock principles we have in our First Amendment. But everybody's in favor of his own freedom of speech. Not so much those other guys. In fact, think of Charlottesville. Let's be honest, how many of you would like to shut down the Nazis? Yeah, me too. You can't. You can't. You got to let the Nazis march, you got to let them spew their venom, and you've got to respond to it. As one Supreme Court justice, whose name escapes me at the moment, famously said, the remedy for bad speech is not less speech, it's more speech. And that even brings up the whole idea of our responsibility as a citizen to stand up to people like this. Okay, so when you see white supremacism, when you see Nazis, you have a duty as a citizen of this country to say, that's wrong, that's un-American. That's the response to it. The problem with shutting down the Nazis is that there are lots of offensive ideas out there. Where do you draw the line? Okay, and at what point do people start self-censoring? At what point do you chill their speech? Because they're afraid if they speak out, they are going to be arrested or suffer some other penalty from the government. Let me emphasize that last phrase, from the government. The First Amendment only protects you against government infringement of your speech. So when people like Ann Coulter will get upset that she gets criticized, because I have the right to say what I say. Yeah, you do. You don't have the right to say what you want without criticism. Okay? If you have the right to say these horrible things, I have the right to respond to them. That's free discussion. Now, we would like it to be civil. We would like to have reasoned discussion. I'm a much bigger fan of NPR than I am of the talking head shows. Don't you get frustrated when you see people talking over each other and just yelling? Who's learning anything there? It's just shouting. One of the troubling things you bring up, sir, is that so many of our young people are not being taught this now, and so we have a real problem on campuses. Well-intentioned students who might be out there under the banner of equality or against white supremacism or whatever, their response is to try to shut down debate. And in fact, there was a terrible instance at a college up in the Northeast, I forget which one it was off the top of my head, where people were injured, okay? People were physically attacked. Now, the speaker, if I recall correctly, was very offensive, to me at least, and to the students there. But it's not appropriate, especially in our universities, that should be bastions of free thought, to shut down speech or to allow students to shut down speech. Now, I realize it's a delicate balance. I realize that universities don't have to invite Nazis to come and speak. But if you've got an area where people, where it's what we call traditional public forum, and the Nazis or the Klan or somebody else wants to come and speak, by and large, you have to let them do it. That's a teachable moment. That's when you talk to your students and you say they have the right to say that. Are you going to, you know, why don't we go there and stand and do a silent protest? Why don't we have our own rally the next week and say how much we hate that, those ideas? That's the appropriate response. When students don't understand that they've got First Amendment rights and that they have to respect the First Amendment rights of others, that's what we're trying to fix here, isn't it? So yes, that's an extremely important point. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
This is trivial, I realize, but what exactly is the difference between a commonwealth like Virginia and Kentucky and the state model? Is there a difference at all?
I think it's 6 letters. It's the same damn thing. Okay. What is it? Massachusetts, Kentucky, Virginia, who else? Pennsylvania. I mean, those are all fine states. They're states. There's no difference as far as I know. Yes, sir.
We seem to have a legislature on the federal level that's been paralyzed. In a sense, you have the Republican Party having sort of two factions, so-called Tea Party and the North sectors.
Uh-huh.
As a result, a lot of legislation isn't being passed. And so I see the executive branches relying more on executive orders, and this comes from Obama as well as Trump. And then the judiciary having to overturn or subject them to that kind of stuff. So in a sense, kind of, you could be left with two branches of government, dysfunctional legislature. What do you see as being the remedy to that?
Well, the first thing I'll respond is that to some extent the gridlock that we see and the contention that we see and the inefficiency that we see is baked into the system. I mean, that's separation of powers, isn't it? And so, you know, that to some extent it's inevitable. And yes, we do seem to be in a particular period of polarization now. I will point out it's not the biggest period of polarization. There were time leading up to the Civil War, right, when they were beating each other with canes in the Senate chambers, okay? Not much going on there. The essential problem is this. It's stated in the first sentence of Federalist Number 1, the first Federalist paper, written by Alexander Hamilton. I have to paraphrase here. My memory's not perfect. It seems to have fallen to us, the people of North America, to determine whether men are capable of governing themselves with reason and debate rather than by force of arms. I mean, throughout most of human history, and to this day, most governments are imposed from above by people with guns or swords or whatever weapons of the day. And somebody declares himself the king. Our Constitution was, well, Akhil Amar of Yale calls it like the hinge of history. This was the first time, this ratification debate that followed the Constitutional Convention, that thousands of people across thousands of square miles openly debated how they were going to govern themselves and then agreed on a document that was a framework for their government. That's the American experiment. And it's being conducted every single day. In fact, the tagline at the end of my radio show is that you are a part of the American experiment. Implicit in that is that it can fail at any time. So it's extraordinarily important that we elect good people to Congress. People who recognize that they have to talk to people and eventually compromise on things, because that's what democracy or representative democracy is. Okay, sure, people ask me, what's the perfect form of government? I know exactly what the perfect form of government. Me as king. I would agree with every decision that government made. And don't worry, I would protect all of you little people. I would take care of you. Okay? But as soon as you say, no, we're gonna vote on stuff, and we're gonna have this freedom of speech stuff, guess what? We've got to compromise with each other. And one of the hardest things to do in our system is to lose a vote. In one sense, that's why we had a civil war. The big issue was slavery, of course. But it was the southern states afraid that they were going to lose votes. And if the minority, and I'm not talking about racial minorities, but I'm talking about the minority in a political sense, is unwilling to stay within the system after it's lost, if it just wants to pick up its toys and go home, which is basically what secession was, then the American experiment fails. I saw another hand from someone who hasn't spoken yet, all the way in the back. Oh, one more.
I have two questions. One, is there a reason why we only have two parties? And two is, don't you think if we had more than two parties, we would be more willing to negotiate and compromise in our legislative process?
You know, that's a question for a political scientist, and I'm sure there are a couple here who could answer it better than I do. I honestly can't answer the question of why there are two political parties. I think perhaps it has something to do with the fact that we're not a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, you basically have one house of your legislature, and you are eventually, they're going to vote themselves within that legislature and come up with a prime minister and then by extension cabinet ministers, right? And so there is a role to be played by third and even fourth and fifth parties because they can become part of a coalition. And they can bargain. They can say, okay, we're going to vote with you guys, but we want the Home Secretary, or we want this, or we want that. And so it just naturally lends itself. These minor parties can actually have a voice, at least if things break down the right way. But in our system, it seems to have developed in sort of a winner-take-all circumstance. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but it seems to have developed that way. You know, you can say historically, there were two parties. There were the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians on one side. There were the Federalists on the other. I don't know. I mean, when you've got a president who's elected and who basically has to be a member of a major party, then it's very hard to get credible presidential candidates from a third party. But if you know that the prime minister is going to come from this conglomerate party called Parliament, well, you might not get a prime minister from the little party, but the little party will have some say in who the prime minister is or what his or her policies are. That's about as much explanation as I can give to you. Do I think it would be better? I don't know. I really don't know. Who hasn't had a chance to talk yet? Nobody? Yes, please.
I'm very interested to know what time and what number your radio program.
Unfortunately, we don't broadcast in Indiana. I'm very sorry, but that's okay. That's perfectly okay. It's the new millennium, right? And so when I started this, I conceived it as a radio show because I'm old, okay, and I listen to radio and I like radio. My kids don't even know what a radio is. Okay, and in fact, my younger son once told me, radio sucks, Dad, and he will not even, he comes in the car and he plugs in his phone and plays the most horrible music. But podcasts are it. I think last year we had 365,000 downloads all over the world. It's very, very easy. If you're interested, just write it down, Your Weekly Constitutional. Type it into Google. You'll come up, one of the first things you'll come up with is our podcast site. And then we have almost 300 hour-long episodes up. And you just pick your subject and feel free to listen. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Does the Constitution help us understand what to do about gerrymandering?
Oh, great question. Current constitutional issue, gerrymandering. The Constitution is almost silent on voting. Did you know that? The original Constitution sets minimum qualifications for voters in federal elections, and basically it says whatever the qualifications are in your state for your larger house of your legislature, I think that I'm paraphrasing here, then you have to have the same qualifications for us. But think about that. The states determine who gets to vote. Who got to vote back in 1787? Mostly guys like me, okay? White guys who own property, okay? Bit by bit over the years, we've amended the Constitution to say, hey, states, you can't discriminate against this group. The first major advance in that area was for African American men with the 15th Amendment. Didn't exactly fix things. Took about another 100 years before we got to any real protection for that. The 19th Amendment, I'm sure you're aware of that one, in 1920. when not a minority was enfranchised, but the majority of the population. Okay, what a good idea. I think so. By the way, do you know what was the last necessary state to ratify the 19th Amendment? Tennessee. Who'd have thunk it, right? It is a fascinating tale. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I will simply tell you that this has one of the most dramatic conclusions of any constitutional story I've ever heard. And I have a wonderful woman whose name is Wanda Sobieski. She's an attorney in downtown Knoxville. I knew her husband. He was the dean at the University of Tennessee College of Law. And one day he said, "You got to talk to my wife." And I went down there, and oh, what a great story it was. And it's funny, and it's great, and you need to listen to that episode. It's entitled, "Should Women Vote?" Okay, and because that was the question then. Should they vote? Fascinating stuff. So, yes?
I don't know if this is too political, but what is your take on this kind of anti-intellectualism and this anti-judiciary move?
Anti-intellectualism. I'm against it. Isn't it just remarkable that people who deny evolution will go down and get their flu shot because the flu bug has evolved in the last year? I can't say, we're in a university community here. I imagine there's probably not one person here who's against knowledge. But isn't it troubling that there seem to be those who are? Wasn't it somebody in the state of Texas, it's always Texas, isn't it, who wanted to ban the teaching of critical thinking in schools? Because what did that do? It just turned children against their parents. No, it turns children against their stupid parents, okay? And it's the most essential thing you can teach a child is how to think for himself or herself. I almost forgot, you asked about gerrymandering. I kind of went out in a different direction. The states basically determine how voting is going to happen, and indeed, in the Electoral College, did you know that every state can choose its electors any way it wants to? And for many years, it was state legislatures that chose them. And of course, dividing up congressional districts and also districts for their state legislatures. This is a really difficult question. Now, I'm no happier than you are with the state of our current gerrymandered districts. It is, however, something that's gone on forever. It comes from Elbridge Gerry, right? Okay, because he drew that district that looked like a salamander, and they called it a gerrymander. This goes back to the founding era of the Republic. Whenever you slice and dice up a vote, whenever you do anything but at-large voting, then there's a question of how do you draw your district lines. And you're always looking, if you're a partisan, and most of us are partisans, for a partisan advantage. And there are basically two ways you can get that. You can either pack people into a district that are well, if you're looking to control it, you are trying to both gain a majority in a majority of districts and also to split up your opponents. And there are two ways to split up your opponents. Either you just cut them to pieces so that they can't form a majority in any district. That's called cracking a district. Or you say, okay, I'm going to have to give up a seat or two, and you pack them all into one district. So cracking and packing, or packing and cracking, whichever order you prefer. People have done this forever. It's just they've gotten really, really good at it. Computers and data allow you to go down to individual households now. Okay? And let's give the Republican Party credit. I mean, they're simply better, or they have been better at it than the Democrats have been. And they also benefited from a Republican wave right before the last census when the redistricting happened, and they got really, really aggressive about it. The question becomes, however, when you get that good, then you can effectively deny a majority rule indefinitely. Okay, so you have state after state. Wisconsin's one example, where something like 60% of the people voted for Democrats and like 60% of the seats are Republican. Okay, and this will persist year after year after year. And there's a case in the Supreme Court called Gill versus Whitford, where someone addresses the basic question, what sort of standard can we use? And what they've done is they've developed an algorithm, and I think they call it, was it voter efficiency? Okay, and they say that, they basically say this: majority rule is good. And any system of gerrymandering which buries one party too effectively, which is basically too good, is unconstitutional because it's denying people their suffrage. North Carolina, a 3-judge panel, perhaps I haven't read the opinion yet, has said that basically they're unconstitutional. Yeah, so this is very much an issue, and the basic question is this: if we've gotten to the point where we can gerrymander and have minority rule, do we even have a republic anymore? Okay? There's not a specific provision you can point to in the Constitution to say it's unconstitutional. They're talking about things like free speech, because you're denying people their political ability to express themselves through their vote. They talk about equality. That's a bit of a leap, too, for reasons I don't have time to go into. So it's hard to find a particular provision to pin it on. But the basic question is, are we a majoritarian country or not? Can we tolerate a system that entrenches a minority, maybe indefinitely, maybe for decades? Are we really America anymore? And I think the court's very troubled by this. Yes?
Well, I think, I mean, I look at the Indiana Constitution, and it essentially says the power lies with the people. And like the other states that are, Maryland's another one.
Mm-hmm.
If people are supposed to be governed, and that was raised as a question, we establish a government that can actually govern the people, but that can also govern itself. In other words,
You brought up a really good point, and that is that every state has its own constitution. Now, we've been talking about the U.S. Constitution for the most part. Some individual state constitutions have provisions in there that might be used very effectively to combat gerrymandering within those states. So let's not forget those state constitutions. Okay, any other? Yes?
With big issues like gun control,
Uh-huh.
we hear a lot about different laws that we want to get passed, but there really aren't conversations about amendments.
Mm-hmm. To the Constitution?
Right. I mean, so we have made amendments through the Bill of Rights. What is the role in that with these large ongoing issues that you just don't really hear people talk about that being a next step rather than laws that are instituted and reversed and
Amending the Constitution is very hard. And amendments tend to come in spurts.
but isn't it hard for a reason?
Oh yeah, it is. I mean,
For
it's
good reason.
sure, it's the basic law of the land. You don't want to amend it too easily or too quickly. Places that allow referenda amendments, for example, end up with some very controversial things, such as well, I was thinking of in the state of Florida, through referenda, they added to their constitution a provision that regulated the size of pens that pigs could be kept in. The pig pen amendment, or something they call it. Okay, now I take no position on this, and I think we should treat animals humanely. Okay, fine. Does that belong in the basic law of a state? I don't know. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but that's the danger of making it too easy to amend your basic law. So yes, I think we're all agree that it should be a big process. Well, it takes supermajorities. There are a couple of different routes, but basically the only way we've ever done it is that Congress, both houses, have to pass by a 2/3 supermajority the exact same language. And then that language is sent out for ratification, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. That requires a consensus. So when have we had that consensus? Well, when we had the Bill of Rights, after the Civil War amendments. By the way, who's seen the movie Lincoln? Damn good movie, and pretty accurate. A little Hollywood, but pretty accurate. I just heard Doris Kearns Goodwin last year talk about it. She said she cried when she saw Daniel Day-Lewis's portrayal because it seemed to bring him to life for her. That was a period when those were passed. Those 3 amendments were passed. The progressive era, late 1800s, early 1900s, when we had women's suffrage, we had the Federal Reserve, the federal income tax. We had several different things happen during that era. And then the Civil Rights era, when there were a number of amendments that were passed. But these were great social movements, and there was broad consensus on them, and then they erupted. Right now, I don't think we're at a period where there's great consensus on the horizon. Maybe there will be. I mean, I'm just speculating here, but one possible outcome, people are saying the Republican Party is destroying itself right now. Someone mentioned a while ago that basically it was just these 2 wings and they're just at each other. Well, one can imagine a circumstance where the Republican Party basically self-destructs, The Democrats sweep into the office. People are talking about a Democratic wave. I don't want to raise any false hopes here. But things have happened like this in our past. That's what it requires for this. Now, if you had a supermajority of Democrats and you had a Democratic president, then that's what you'd need to actually be able to propose an amendment, and then that same consensus would have to exist in 3/4 of the states. That doesn't happen. The stars don't align that frequently. Someone back there hasn't said, yes?
This is perhaps a line. Sorry, my voice is coming.
Go ahead.
But I have been reading that there are now quite a number of states legislatures that have called for a constitutional amendment to the for a balanced budget, and that the concern is not necessarily that about yes, that's the one issue is whether or not that is appropriate for a balanced budget amendment. I don't think it makes sense, but the concern is that once you call a convention, anything can be brought up to amend the Constitution, and then all bets are off. And I don't know, I'm an English historian, so believe it or not, I'm not as good at American history and constitutional history. So I'm not sure.
I'm not that good at English history, so we're even.
How much of a danger that is that if enough state legislatures say, yes, we want to have a constitutional convention to discuss an amendment for a balanced budget, then other stuff will come up, and because so many state legislatures are controlled by one party, the Republican Party,
So I'm guessing you don't see Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan as a modern day, Adams and Jefferson, or no?
Is that actually a concern? That if a constitutional convention comes to the, is mandated, then is our constitution?
It's, theoretically speaking, it is a concern. Okay, Article 5 of the Constitution provides a couple of different methods for amending it. One of them that's never been used is if enough states call for another constitutional convention, then it needs to be called. Forgive me, I forget whether it's 2/3 or 3/4 that have to call for it. It's a supermajority. I think it's 2/3, okay, because it's the first stage of the process. Then theoretically you call another constitutional convention, and then theoretically they can propose anything they want to propose, just like they did in 1787, where they effectively threw out the Articles of Confederation. But then 3/4 of the states would have to ratify. So even if you're concerned about Newt Gingrich's proposals, or on the other end of the spectrum, Hillary Clinton, if you don't like what she might propose, it would have to go through a supermajority approval process. The interesting question is, how would this happen? Who's in charge of this process? People will go and they will count up resolutions that have been passed decades ago by some state legislature in Arkansas that may or may not be calling for a general convention, or may specifically say we want a convention to consider this. And some people claim to have counted up that there are enough states that have called for this, therefore we need to have a convention. Okay, well, who calls it? How does this work? Is a call for a specific amendment convention the same as a call for a general? No, nobody's really in charge of this. So will such a thing actually happen? I doubt it. And even if it did happen, we've always got the consolation that anything really wacky probably wouldn't be approved by 3/4 of the states.
Well, I guess probably what I was thinking is that I agree with you. I think that, who knows? I guess it's the chaos that would ensue. Not so much that it was actually going to have a constitutional convention, but then nothing gets done if everybody, I guess that's what I was concerned with.
You mean if really wacky things were happening on new outrage every day, that somehow government wouldn't function? Is that what you're proposing? I don't know. I think it's completely unrealistic. Okay. Yes, sir.
When you were talking about other forms of government, you were talking about the force of arms, the force of law. Could you talk about how you perceive the Second Amendment, and the good points, the bad points to it, and as it relates to an armed citizenry?
I always preface questions about this by saying that I'm probably one of the most moderate people on the issue of the Second Amendment you'll ever meet. I grew up in a house that had guns in it. I learned how to shoot when I was very young. I own several guns today, including a handgun. I don't shoot them much. I don't remember the last time I did. I'm not an extremist on this issue. I recognize that there are more guns than people in this country, and that guns are durable products that can last literally hundreds of years. I've seen flintlocks fired. They're still perfectly serviceable. Is there an issue with gun violence in this country? You bet there is. Is there a reason to regulate guns and to keep them out of the hands of bad people and children and incompetent people? Yes, those are all reasonable goals. I lament the fact that we're so polarized that we can't even have a discussion about that, okay? The Second Amendment is a very interesting area, and it's very easy to quote. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, when I was in law school in the 1980s, we skipped that part because the professor basically said, it's about militias. The only Supreme Court case on point was the 1939 Miller decision, in which a fellow named Miller was charged under a federal gun control statute for having possessed a sawed-off shotgun. And he said, I have the Second Amendment right to have this weapon, and the court dismissed it in a single line of what's commonly called dictum, because it really didn't rely upon it to reach its decision. It said, Second Amendment, that's about a militia. This is not a militia weapon. You're not a member of militia. Let's go on. Just dismissed it. Okay, it's about militias, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The court, people who claim to be textualists and those of original intent, simply chopped off that first clause. In fact, they began with the second clause, interpreted it, and then came back and showed how the first clause really didn't interfere with that. In fact, they dismissed it as they called it a prefatory clause. One constitutional scholar recently said, it's like they were writing in Hebrew. They started at the end of the sentence, the right part of the sentence, and they read backward. It's justly criticized as one of the least historical and least analytical decisions in Supreme Court history. Now, I say that as a person who's not necessarily wants to confiscate everybody's guns. I mean, again, I don't think I have an extreme position on this. I think it was a bad decision. And historians will tell you the history in it is bad history. And it was basically cherry-picked with very much a result in mind. Now, there's a whole fascinating history behind that case. There was a guy whose name I always forget. He was not the NRA. He was not a member of the NRA, as far as I know. The NRA was scared to bring a case about the Second Amendment because it was afraid it would lose. But this guy said, no, I want to bring this case. And so he did something that's often done in this day and age, and it has been done ever since the Civil Rights Movement. He went and looked for the perfect plaintiff. And he found him. He found a guy by the name of Dick Heller. Anyone know who Dick Heller was or is? Get this now. He is a cop who works for the federal government, carrying a gun, protecting federal judges. Do you think a federal judge would be inclined to trust Dick Heller with a gun? Yeah, but Dick Heller is a resident of the District of Columbia and could not get a permit to have his own gun in his own house. So they had him go out and apply for this, get denied, and now they got the perfect plaintiff. And they bring it right up through the federal system, and they eventually get the Supreme Court to issue the decision that they did issue. And they say you've got an individual right to keep and bear arms by simply ignoring the militia part of it and coming up with some very tenuous analysis that somehow the Second Amendment was designed to give you the right to keep weapons in case a bad guy showed up at your house. Okay? It's simply not historical. But in the immortal words of Thomas Brennan, that's it. Okay? It's the law of the land. It's the law of the land. Does it mean, here's one thing I will say about this, does it mean, as some people will say, that all regulations of firearms are therefore unconstitutional? Of course not. No constitutional right is absolute. Even the First Amendment has exceptions, right? Even our most cherished rights have exceptions. If you read the Heller decision, even Justice Scalia, who wrote it, said this does not mean that you can't regulate guns. He gives a list of sorts of regulations that are out there. Justice Scalia does one thing, though, that really irritates me. He says, well, several things that really irritated me, but this one in particular, he said, there are those who will claim that the Second Amendment only applies to the weapons of that era, to flintlock rifles. We do not interpret the Constitution that way. Yeah, you do. You're supposedly an originalist. There are all sorts of opinions where Scalia goes back and interprets, well, this is what they meant back when they did the Fourth Amendment. This is what knock and announce meant back then. Okay, well then, if you're going to keep and bear arms, you have to define what the arms are, and they were flintlocks. Okay, and they were swords. They were not AK-47s. Did anyone ever see that video? It's by a gun control group where it shows this really unhappy-looking middle-aged guy getting out of his car, and he carries something into an office, and it turns out it's a gun. Everyone's screaming, oh my God, and he goes over, and it's a flintlock. And he gets off one shot, and then he starts reloading it, and in the meantime, everybody runs away. Everybody's safe. It does make a difference what kind of arms we're talking about, and it's not crazy to say, maybe we should look and see what they meant back in the day. I don't think they meant nuclear weapons. I really don't. Okay? Are we out of time? Okay, we're out of time. Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.
This is a fabulous beginning for this series, and Nicola has a few announcements and
Yes, we want to point out, we've got various brochures over here, and more brochures of the series. It's continuing on Thursday night with Ken Stewart from the Indiana Academy, who is going to talk about Congress. And my son had Ken Stewart, and he said, Mr. Stewart is so good, I might drive up from Cincinnati just to hear him one more time. And then I also wanted to point out some of the questions that have been raised today. Civil discourse, particularly in the classroom. Sarah Drake Brown, when she speaks in February, will be talking on those issues. And I'll be talking about voting and how the state sets requirements for voting when I do my talk. So there are reasons to hang around and keep coming to these, including Mr. Stewart's on Thursday night in the Patterson Building at Ivy Tech, but we also wanted to give Stuart Harris this little token of
Thank you very much.
appreciation.
Thank you very much. Cool. Oh, it's chocolate. Very good. Thank you.
Yes, it's Muncie chocolate.
Muncie chocolate.
Lowry's chocolate.
All right. Good.
And thank you so much. You came out despite the weather and despite there's football on TV. So thank you.
Okay.